On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was rushing around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband, Barry, who was busy washing the last of the breakfast dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a clean coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and just like any other Tuesday, they were both getting ready for what they knew would be busy days at work. Charlotte was a well-respected school administrator for the local district, and Barry was the acting mayor of their small town, a tight-knit community of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As Barry dried his hands and left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room table, Charlotte, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee, reminded him about her schedule. She had a hair appointment later that morning, and she also wanted to let him know she'd probably be home later than usual. The reason was she had a difficult meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a tense and complicated legal battle. The battle was with her own cousin, a man named Wayne, and it was all over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had been quite successful and had left a lot of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne believed that he deserved a piece of that land too. So he was formally contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all scheduled to meet and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry turned to Charlotte and asked if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. Had she made up her mind about what to do? Charlotte just shook her head and said no, she was still thinking it over. She knew deep down she didn't want to just give up the land her uncle had specifically left to her. But at the same time, she hated the idea of tearing her family apart over money. It just wasn't worth it to her. Barry walked over to where she was standing, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her that whatever happened, no matter what she decided, the family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and then he left for work. Once Barry was out the door, Charlotte finished her coffee and left the kitchen. She walked up the stairs and knocked gently on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles rapped against the wood, Charlotte heard a low groan from inside the room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and very pale. Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. The reason Kara looked and sounded the way she did was because she was pregnant and she was dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. Now, to be honest, Charlotte was not at all thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But what made it even worse for her was that she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank too much, he was constantly getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he was just not the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave. They had laid down the law and told her you cannot date him anymore. But in secret, the two teenagers had continued to see each other. And now, Kara was pregnant. So, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she also knew, more than ever, that her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to navigate the challenges of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. With that in mind, she stepped into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under the covers and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She walked around the room, tidying up a little bit as she spoke. Then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She said it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara told her that she did have a babysitting job that would take up most of the day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said goodbye, and then explained that she had to get going to work herself. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the entryway table, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte's car was driving back down her quiet residential street, heading toward her house. She lived in a respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime had been very low in the area. Although it was true that recently there had been a string of robberies nearby, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, then she'd gone to the salon for her scheduled haircut, and pretty soon she needed to get back to the office for a few more hours before her big afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled. So she wanted to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before heading back to work to finish up her day. She pulled her car into the garage, got out, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. And just as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. The sound surprised her. She thought Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and Barry almost never came home for his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down on the counter and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter Heather pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock that evening. But Heather didn't think too much of it. She just figured her mom's plans had changed. So she grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. Then, as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw that the interior door, the one that led from the garage into the kitchen, was already open, but just a crack. This was also kind of strange. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And so now, sensing that maybe something was a little bit off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open. She called out for her mother, asking what she was doing home so early. But there was no answer. The house was completely silent. Heather stepped into the kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began walking through the first floor of the house, trying to figure out where her mom was. She couldn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She walked from the kitchen, through the dining room, and as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the stairs, completely motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side and grabbed her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold to the touch. In a panic, Heather ran into the living room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out the front door crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter stopped his patrol car, got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who immediately begged him to come inside and help her mom. Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. He told her to stay outside on the porch while he went in to investigate. And she did. She stayed out front, just quietly weeping to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase. She was completely still. Nearby, the contents of a woman's purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. So, Carter stood back up and just took a moment to assess the scene. The first thing he noticed was that there was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. This made him wonder if maybe she had suffered a seizure or some sort of severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs. Maybe she had lost her balance and fallen, and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw that there were very obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a dark red mark that went all the way around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had likely not just fallen down the stairs. It looked like she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he and his team had been scouring the crime scene for any possible clues, and now he was holding two white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots. They looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to bag the towels as evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood even belonged to Charlotte, but if it did, it could be a very important clue. After searching the entire house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. The television and other valuables were all still in their proper places. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but all of her cash and her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the very end to try to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a very weak attempt. This did not look like a robbery at all. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from near the front door. He went to go see what was going on, and he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by two of his forensics officers. After a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry pushed right past them. And right away, he saw what they were trying to keep him from seeing. He saw his wife's body lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't catch his breath. Barry was gasping for air and was really struggling to breathe. Then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. Carter thought for a second that he might be having a heart attack. So, instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse told him he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the grieving mayor. It was because he needed to talk to the mayor. As the spouse of a potential murder victim, he needed to know what Barry knew as soon as possible. So, he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. One of them was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day when she was the one who came running out and directed him inside. They had talked a little bit, but Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry right now, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation. And so, he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up, and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter walked over and sat down next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting next to Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. Then he asked both of them how their dad was doing. Heather explained that so far, the doctors believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was most likely a severe panic attack. But they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't really done anything suspicious, but Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 o'clock that morning. It wasn't until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that her coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to the office. They said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With that timeline in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been during that specific window of time. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day, and Heather said she had been at her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother or who might have wanted to hurt her. The girls immediately shook their heads and said, "Absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was wonderful and everybody seemed to like her." They insisted they were just a happy, normal family with no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while he was driving to work that morning. And since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. Now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and her coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, none of that had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this early stage in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband, but he was still in the hospital and was not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the other officers were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital. They had determined that his heart was fine and that he had indeed just had a severe panic attack. So, as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the police station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he had left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had gone right back to work. And he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather, telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was primarily just looking at Barry's hands and his arms. He was looking for any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on what they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably, there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, he could see no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. So, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he wasn't a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was being honest. At some point, Carter shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually 2 people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He explained that the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. So Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. Barry explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair. He thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had immediately made Carter pretty suspicious. During that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he leaned right in and started to grill him. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch that day, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work, truly, all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several of his coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish. He just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he had been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. Carter just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. Dave admitted that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte or Barry for that matter. And he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day, at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints. Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time," but he agreed to do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the two long strings that were dangling from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. This level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the physical evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of suspects was basically down to 0. If Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had strangled his girlfriend in a way that was similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Adding to the confusion, their fingerprint expert had told Carter that the third unidentified set of prints found at the scene could possibly belong to a child, and so it might be totally unrelated to the murder. So now, as Carter looked over at the desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced himself for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the investigation. As difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was feeling that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, he also understood their frustration. He was feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the investigation had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. In fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he had a dream about it, all the media attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And calls had once again begun flowing into the tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and local gossip. But on that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office door, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share, information that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, the forensic evidence and new witness testimony, this is what police believe actually happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the garage. When they saw it, their heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had arrived at just the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they walked up into the open garage, and they went over to the interior door that led into the house. They tried the handle and found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. The killer quietly closed the door behind them. They went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them standing there. Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them. The killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. So, the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then, the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring from Charlotte's nose. Stunned, she just stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. At this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. Persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was now clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer had her in an unbreakable chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. When the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, motionless and very likely dead, the reality of what had just happened finally hit them. In a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor. They rushed down the stairs and quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then they dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then, they grabbed Charlotte's purse off a nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was just a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped. He killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he desperately needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder early on in the investigation, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he truly was. And so, it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips himself to redirect attention away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Our story begins in northeast Brazil in April of 1977. Apolinario Correa and his 3 brothers, Firmino, Oriano, and Jose, were hard workers. They made their living in a tough but honest way. They were lumberjacks, but not in the traditional sense of working in a vast forest. Their territory was a small, uninhabited island just off the coast called Ilha dos Caranguejos, or Crab Island. The brothers had a sturdy boat, and they'd make regular trips out to the island, chop down valuable timber, load it onto their boat, and sail back to the mainland to sell it to local construction companies. It was a good business. The wood from Crab Island was high quality, and because they were the only ones willing to go there, they had the whole place to themselves. And there was a very specific reason they were the only ones willing to go there. Most people in their coastal community were terrified of Crab Island. For generations, stories had been passed down. Spooky stories. People who had dared to venture onto the island, maybe for a picnic or to explore, would come back with unsettling tales. They'd talk about hearing strange voices whispering from deep within the island's dense forest, especially after the sun went down. This was particularly strange because everyone knew for a fact that nobody lived on the island. There were no homes, no shacks, nothing. And then there were the lights. Fishermen out on the water at night would sometimes see bizarre, colorful lights flashing and dancing above the treetops of Crab Island, with no logical explanation. It was a place steeped in local folklore, a place most people gave a wide berth. But the Correa brothers were practical men. Apolinario, the oldest, was level-headed. Firmino was strong and quiet. Oriano was the joker of the group, and Jose, the youngest, looked up to them all. They had heard the stories their whole lives, but they just didn't buy into them. To them, the whispers were just the wind in the trees, and the lights were probably just swamp gas or some other natural phenomenon. The fear their neighbors had was actually a business advantage. It meant no competition. So they went to Crab Island all the time, and it was always the same. Just them, the trees, and the sound of the ocean. It was just another job site. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1977, the four brothers readied their boat for another trip. The plan was simple, the same one they'd executed dozens of times. They would set off in the morning and aim to arrive at the island around noon, which was high tide. This was important because the waters around Crab Island were very shallow, surrounded by vast mudflats. You could only get the boat close to the shore during high tide. They'd anchor the boat, wade to the island, and spend the entire afternoon felling trees. As the tide went out, their boat would eventually come to rest on the soft mud, stranded until the tide came back in. This was all part of the plan. They didn't intend to sail back right away. They'd finish their work, cook dinner over a campfire on the beach, and then head back to the boat to get a few hours of sleep. By the time they woke up around midnight, the next high tide would have lifted their boat free from the mud, and they could begin the peaceful journey home under the stars. It was a solid, well-rehearsed plan. And so, that's exactly what they did. They arrived at Crab Island at about 12 p.m., the sun high in the sky. The day was hot and humid, and the work was grueling. For hours, the only sounds on the island were the rhythmic thud of their axes against wood and the crash of falling trees. They worked until their muscles ached and their shirts were soaked with sweat. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant orange and purple. They gathered up their tools and built a small, crackling campfire on the beach. They cooked their simple dinner of fish and rice, talking and laughing as they always did. They probably made fun of the ghost stories, feeling perfectly safe and content on their island. Around 8 p.m., after they'd finished eating, Apolinario took a bucket of seawater and carefully doused the campfire, making sure every last ember was extinguished. The only light now came from the moon, casting long shadows across the beach. The tide was fully out. Their boat was sitting about 100 yards away, a dark silhouette resting on the glistening mudflats. The four brothers took off their boots, rolled up their pants, and began the familiar trudge through the thick, ankle-deep mud towards their vessel. They climbed aboard, rinsed the mud from their feet, and went into the small main cabin. It was cramped, but it was shelter. They laid out their sleeping pads on the floor, and exhausted from the day's labor, it didn't take long for all four of them to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Apolinario had only meant to sleep for a few hours, just until the tide came back in. But when he opened his eyes again, he knew instantly that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin was still and dark, but through the small porthole window, he could see that the sky outside wasn't black anymore. It was that soft, hazy pink of early dawn. He let out a frustrated groan. They had all slept right through the midnight high tide. Their boat had been lifted by the water, and then, as the tide receded again, it had settled right back down into the mud. They were stuck. Again. Now they'd have to wait all the way until the next high tide, likely around noon. A whole half-day wasted. Annoyed, Apolinario sat up and looked around the small cabin to see if his brothers were awake. He saw the familiar lumps of his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, still asleep on their pads. They each had their thin blankets pulled up right over their faces to block out the morning light. But then his eyes fell on the third sleeping pad, the one belonging to his brother, Oriano. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. Oriano wasn't in the cabin. Apolinario wasn't immediately alarmed. Oriano was an early riser. He was probably just outside on the deck, getting some fresh air, or answering the call of nature. But just as Apollinario was thinking this, the sound hit him. A piercing, blood-curdling scream from just outside the cabin door. It was a sound of absolute, unimaginable pain. It was Oriano's voice. In a split second, Apollinario's annoyance at oversleeping was replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline and fear. He scrambled to his feet, threw open the cabin door, and rushed out onto the deck. And what he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was his brother, Oriano, standing there, clutching at his own body, his face twisted in a mask of agony. His skin, all of his exposed skin on his face, his neck, his arms, was a mess of horrific burns. It looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to him. It was red and blistering, and in some places, it looked like it was literally peeling away from the muscle. Apollinario was so horrified he couldn't move. His brain just couldn't process what he was seeing. And then, through the shock, he noticed something that was even stranger, something that made absolutely no sense. Despite the terrible burns that covered his brother's body, Oriano's clothes, his simple work shirt and pants, were perfectly fine. They weren't scorched, they weren't singed, there wasn't a single mark on them. It was as if his skin had spontaneously caught on fire from the inside out, while leaving his clothes completely untouched. Oriano was just screaming and screaming, stumbling around the deck in pure agony, and Apollinario had no idea what to do, no idea what could have possibly caused this. While Apollinario stood there, frozen in shock, he heard another sound. This one was coming from back inside the cabin where he had just been. It was a low, guttural moaning, a sound of deep suffering. Acting on pure instinct, he spun around and ran back into the cabin. He knew the sound was coming from one of his other two brothers, who were still under their blankets. He lurched towards the closest one, Firmino, and tore the blanket off of him. The sight was just as horrifying as what he'd seen on deck. Firmino was writhing on his sleeping pad, moaning in pain, and his skin was just as horribly burned as Oriano's. It was raw and red and looked like it was sliding off his body. And just like with Oriano, Firmino's clothes were completely undamaged. Apollinario's mind was reeling. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? His eyes darted over to his last brother, Jose, who was still lying on his sleeping pad, the blanket still covering him. He was quiet. He wasn't moaning. Maybe he was okay. With a trembling hand, Apollinario reached over and pulled back Jose's blanket. Jose was not burned. There wasn't a mark on him. But he was not okay. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling of the cabin. He wasn't breathing. Jose was dead. The next 6 hours must have been the longest and most torturous of Apollinario's life. He was on a tiny boat, stuck in the mud, on a supposedly haunted island. His brother Oriano was outside, still screaming in agony from his mysterious burns. His brother Firmino was inside, barely conscious and fading fast from his own horrific injuries. And his youngest brother Jose was lying dead just a few feet away. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't call for help, they had no radio, and he couldn't leave. He had to simply wait, surrounded by death and suffering, for the tide to slowly, agonizingly creep back in and lift their boat from the mud. He tried to comfort his injured brothers, to give them water, to do anything, but he was completely helpless. Finally, around noon, the water was high enough, the boat lifted, and Apollinario was free. He started the engine and raced back towards the mainland, his mind a chaotic storm of grief and confusion. When they finally reached their home port, a small crowd gathered, shocked at the scene. Oriano, who was badly hurt but still conscious and able to walk, stayed behind with the body of their brother Jose, waiting for the authorities. Apollinario knew Firmino's injuries were the most severe. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, and his body looked like it was shutting down. Apollinario had to get him to a hospital, and fast. He managed to get his brother into a vehicle and sped off towards the nearest medical facility. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed out to help. Firmino was barely clinging to life. As they got him onto a gurney and started wheeling him into the emergency room, a doctor leaned in close to him. The doctor knew they needed to understand what had happened to treat these bizarre injuries. He asked Firmino, "What happened? How did you get these burns?" Firmino's eyes fluttered open. He was barely able to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. But right before he slipped into a deep coma from his burns, he was able to get out a few chilling words. He told the doctor that sometime during the night, while they were all asleep in the boat on Crab Island, he had woken up for a moment. He had looked out the small porthole window from inside the cabin. And what he saw, he said, was an inexplicable ball of fire just hovering in the air outside the boat. And that was the last thing he remembered. The local police were notified immediately, and they opened an investigation into the bizarre and tragic events on Crab Island. They were faced with a case that seemed to defy all logic. One man dead with no apparent cause, two men with catastrophic burns that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and one man, Apollinario, who was completely unharmed and completely bewildered. The first person they spoke to at length was Apollinario. He told them everything he could remember, from their normal workday to the horrifying discovery in the morning. He was clearly traumatized, and his story, as strange as it was, seemed genuine. The investigators had to consider all possibilities, no matter how unlikely. Their first theory was that some sort of fight had broken out among the brothers. Maybe an argument over money or work had escalated into extreme violence. Perhaps Apollinario was lying to cover up his own involvement. But this theory quickly fell apart. The Correa brothers were known to be very close. There was no history of violence or serious arguments between them. And, more importantly, this theory couldn't explain the physical evidence. How could a fight result in two men being burned so severely while their clothes remained untouched? And how did Jose die without a single mark on him? An autopsy would later be performed on Jose, and the coroner was stumped. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, likely brought on by extreme shock or terror. But what had terrified him to death? The police then considered the possibility of drugs or alcohol. Maybe the men had consumed some sort of hallucinogen, and in their altered state they had hurt themselves or each other. This could potentially explain their strange stories and lack of memory. But toxicology reports were run on all the brothers, including Jose. They all came back completely clean. There were no drugs, no unusual levels of alcohol, nothing in their systems that could explain what had happened. So, the investigators moved on to environmental factors. The most plausible, though still far-fetched, theory they could come up with was a freak lightning strike. Their idea was that maybe lightning had struck the wet beach or the water near the boat, and somehow the electrical charge had reflected off the sand or the water and shot into the boat, striking the men. But the experts they consulted said this was incredibly unlikely. A lightning strike powerful enough to inflict those kinds of burns would have left obvious signs of its passing. It would have scorched the boat, maybe blown a hole in the hull, or damaged the boat's electronics. But when the police forensics team went out to Crab Island to examine the boat and the surrounding area, they found nothing. The boat was completely undamaged. There were no scorch marks, no signs of an explosion or a fire. The beach was pristine. There were no unusual craters or fused sand that a lightning strike would leave behind. In fact, the big takeaway from the on-site investigation was that they found absolutely no evidence of anything unusual happening at all. It was as if the island itself was hiding its secrets. The only piece of information that pointed to something truly strange was Firmino's dying declaration about the ball of fire. The police had to consider it, but what could they do with it? To them, it sounded like the hallucination of a man in extreme pain and shock. A ball of fire hovering in the air? It sounded like something from a science fiction story, not a police report. With no physical evidence, no witnesses who could remember anything, and no logical explanation, the investigation hit a dead end. Miraculously, both Firmino and Oriano survived. They spent months in the hospital undergoing painful treatments and skin grafts. They eventually made full physical recoveries. But the mental and emotional scars remained. And strangest of all, neither of them ever regained any memory of what happened that night. Their last clear memory was of going to sleep in the cabin. The next thing they knew, they were in unimaginable pain. The period in between was a complete and total blank. With their two key witnesses unable to provide any details, and with a total lack of evidence, the police had no choice but to close the case. The official file on the death of Jose Correa and the injuries of his brothers was stamped unsolved, with no official explanation ever given. The Correa family was left to grieve without answers, and the terrifying mystery of Crab Island only grew deeper. For 9 years, life went on. The surviving Correa brothers never returned to Crab Island. They found other ways to make a living. But the story of what happened to them became a legendary cautionary tale in their community. The island, which had always been considered haunted, was now seen as a place of genuine, tangible danger. People avoided it more than ever. The strange stories, however, didn't stop. Fishermen continued to report seeing odd lights in the sky over the island. But for 9 years, no one was brave or foolish enough to spend the night there. Then, in April of 1986, almost 9 years to the day after the Correa brothers' ordeal, a different crew of men decided to tempt fate. It was a team of 4 lumberjacks, unrelated to the Correas, who were new to the area. They heard that the timber on Crab Island was plentiful and untouched. They likely heard the stories as well, but just like the Correa brothers before them, they probably dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. They were there to do a job and make money, not to hunt for ghosts. Their plan was almost identical to the one the Correas had used. They sailed to the island, spent the day harvesting lumber, and as evening fell, they settled in for the night, planning to leave on the next high tide. They were out in the woods, not far from the beach, when suddenly all 4 of them recalled hearing a single, loud, crashing sound echo through the forest. It was a noise they couldn't identify. And right after they heard that sound, all 4 of them, at the exact same moment, simply fell unconscious. They didn't feel sick, they didn't feel dizzy. It was like a switch was flipped and their consciousness was just turned off. When they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. They were disoriented, confused, with massive gaps in their memory. As they slowly came to their senses and took stock of their situation, a horrifying sense of déjà vu fell over the island. One of the 4 men was dead. He had no visible injuries, no marks on his body. He was just gone. And another one of the men was inexplicably covered in severe burns. And just like with Firmino and Oriano 9 years earlier, the survivors' clothes were perfectly intact. The 2 other men were unharmed, but in a state of shock. When authorities investigated this second incident, they were faced with the exact same impossible puzzle. The survivors had no memory of what happened between hearing the crashing sound and waking up 18 hours later. The autopsy on the deceased man was, once again, inconclusive, pointing to a probable heart attack induced by terror. And the man with the burns couldn't explain how he got them. A thorough search of the island once again revealed nothing. No footprints, no scorch marks, no evidence of any kind. It was a near-perfect carbon copy of the tragedy that had befallen the Correa brothers. The 2 incidents, separated by 9 years, are so chillingly similar that it's hard to dismiss them as coincidence. In both cases, a group of lumberjacks spent the night on the island. In both cases, one person died of unexplained causes, appearing to be scared to death. In both cases, at least one other person suffered severe, unexplainable burns that did not affect their clothing. And in both cases, the survivors had complete amnesia of the event itself. So, what is really happening on Crab Island? To this day, no one knows for sure. The official case files remain closed and unsolved. But there are theories, though they venture far from conventional explanations. Some people believe the island is home to a paranormal entity, a malevolent spirit that attacks those who trespass on its territory. The voices and the lights that people have reported for decades could be signs of this presence. Others look towards a more extraterrestrial explanation. The description Firmino gave of a ball of fire hovering in the air sounds very similar to many UFO sightings, specifically reports of ball lightning or unidentified aerial phenomena. The burns, which spared clothing, are consistent with injuries caused by intense microwave radiation, a technology often associated with advanced non-human craft. Perhaps these men stumbled upon something not of this world, something that reacted defensively and with lethal force. Whatever the truth is, the story of the Korea brothers and the second crew serves as a haunting reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we cannot explain. For the families involved, there is no closure, only the lingering pain of loss and the endless, unanswerable question of what truly happened on those nights. Crab Island remains uninhabited, a place of quiet beauty by day and a place of profound, terrifying mystery by night. It stands as a silent monument to a series of events that defy logic and blur the line between folklore and a dark, terrifying reality. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The demolition of Elmwood Avenue. When police finally walked into the split-level home on Elmwood Avenue in Staten Island, seasoned detectives actually stopped in their tracks. It wasn't just the sheer violence of the scene. It was the house itself is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The drywall in the living room had been violently torn down to the wooden studs. Floorboards in the narrow hallway were pried up, their rusted nails bent and sticking out like jagged teeth. The pink fiberglass insulation was ripped out of the ceiling in massive chunks, scattered across the hardwood like dirty, toxic snow. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And honestly, at first glance, the first responders thought they were walking into the aftermath of a botched home renovation. Or maybe a freak gas explosion. But it wasn't an explosion. Somebody had systematically, obsessively torn this house apart with a crowbar and their bare hands. They weren't just destroying the property, they were looking for something inside the walls. Or maybe they were looking for a way out. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But to understand how a quiet suburban home became a chaotic, gutted crime scene, we have to rewind just 3 weeks. Back to a time when the house was whole and its owner was still alive. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. It's October 8th. The air in Staten Island has just started to get that sharp autumn bite to it. We meet Clara Vance. She's 31 years old, a pediatric physical therapist, and she has just purchased this house. It's her first home. A modest, slightly dated split level that she saved up for years to afford. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Clara's life right now is a messy, exhausting blur of mundane adult milestones. She spends her days helping kids recover from sports injuries, and her nights painting over ugly 1980s wallpaper while drinking lukewarm, day-old coffee. If you looked through her windows during that first week, you wouldn't see a victim. You'd see a normal person sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout pad thai amidst a fortress of moving boxes, sorting through a pile of junk mail and credit card offers. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. The neighborhood itself is incredibly quiet. You can hear the distant, low drone of the Staten Island Expressway if the wind blows right, but mostly it's just the sound of wind chimes and the occasional annoyingly loud leaf blower from the guy across the street. It's safe. It's boring. It's exactly what Clara wanted. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But a house that has stood for 40 years has its own quirks, its own settling noises. And at first, that's all Clara thinks she's dealing with. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. The first sign that something was wrong, the very first disturbance, was so minor, you or I probably would have ignored it entirely. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. It's a Tuesday evening, October 15th. Clara comes home from a long, exhausting 12-hour shift. It's raining. That heavy, cold October rain that chills you to the bone. She does her normal routine, unlocks the heavy wooden front door, drops her keys in the ceramic bowl on the entryway table, and kicks off her wet sneakers. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. As she walks down the hall, she shivers. It is freezing inside the house, Is less than BR, is greater than is less than, BR is greater than. She glances at the thermostat on the wall. It's an old, yellowed plastic dial, and it's turned all the way down to 55 degrees. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Now, at this point, if you're Clara, your mind does not immediately jump to, there is an intruder in my home. Human beings don't work like that. We rationalize. Clara stands there in the dim hallway, her wet socks soaking into the hardwood, and she just stares at the dial. She frowns, her mind working through a tired checklist. Did I bump it with my shoulder this morning when I was carrying out the trash? Is the wiring faulty? She physically lingers there for a long moment, a slight knot of annoyance forming in her stomach. Not fear. Just the creeping dread of an unexpected repair bill. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. She sighs, turns the dial up to 70, and walks into the kitchen to put the kettle on. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. She fills the kettle, sets it on the stove, and waits. The kitchen is dead silent, save for the steady drumming of rain against the window pane. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Then she hears it. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. It's not a crash. It's not a cinematic footstep. It is a soft, rhythmic times thump. 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 Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. It sounds like it's coming from directly beneath her feet. From inside the floor vents, is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. Clara freezes. The kettle hasn't started whistling yet. She tilts her head, her breath catching slightly in her throat, straining to listen over the sound of the rain. Thump, thump. It's faint, muffled by the aluminum ductwork. Like a heavy book being dropped, over and over, in the crawl space. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. She tells herself it's just the old pipes expanding as the heat finally kicks on. That's what old houses do, right? They make noises. They settle. They breathe. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But as Clara stares down at the metal grate on the floor, she notices something else. Something she definitely didn't do. The screws holding the vent cover to the floor are completely gone, and the metal grate is sitting slightly crooked, pushed up just a fraction of an inch from the wood. Clara stares at the crooked metal grate. For a long, uncomfortable minute, she doesn't move. She just breathes, listening. The thumping has completely stopped. Now, honestly, I think a lot of us like to imagine we'd grab a weapon or run out the front door or call 911 right then and there. But Clara doesn't. Because in real life, you don't want to be the crazy person who calls the cops over a loose floor vent. She kneels down, her knees popping on the cold hardwood, and uses her index finger to lift the heavy iron grate. A rush of stale, freezing air hits her face. It smells heavily of damp earth and old metallic dust. She pulls out her phone, flicks on the flashlight, and shines it down into the duct. But there's nothing. Just the ridged silver tubing disappearing into the pitch-black crawl space of her Staten Island foundation. Suddenly, the kettle on the stove behind her shrieks, making her jump so hard she drops the grate. It clatters loudly into place. Her heart is hammering against her ribs, but the immediate scare breaks the tension. She lets out a shaky breath, rubs her eyes, and goes to make her tea. The next morning, Wednesday, the heavy rain has cleared up, leaving that crisp, bright October air. Clara is standing in her kitchen, drinking a cup of slightly burnt coffee from the pot she set on an automatic timer, looking out at the garbage trucks rumbling down her street. She decides to call her landlord, an older guy named Sal who manages a few properties in the borough. She tells him about the thermostat, the freezing house, and the loose vent. Sal immediately groans on the other end of the line. "Ah, geez, Clara. I'm sorry. I should have texted you. I had the HVAC guys doing winter prep on the block yesterday. I told them to pop in and bleed the radiators, check the subfloor ducts. Guys probably bumped the thermostat and forgot to screw your vent back in." When Clara hears that, It feels like a physical weight is lifted off her chest. She actually laughs, feeling completely ridiculous for being so spooked the night before. "Oh, thank God," she tells Sal. "I was starting to think I had a ghost." Sal chuckles, tells her he'll yell at the contractors, and they hang up. It makes perfect sense. It is the logical, boring explanation we all crave when we're scared. And for the next 5 days, Clara goes back to normal. This is the breathing room, where life just happens. She works her exhausting shifts. She sorts through junk mail on the counter, mostly credit card pre-approvals and damp grocery flyers. She complains about her sore feet. But slowly, subtly, the house starts to feel off. It's not a sudden jump scare. It's a creeping, uncomfortable misalignment of her reality. On Friday, her favorite paring knife isn't in the drying rack where she left it. She finds it sitting randomly on the bathroom counter. On Saturday morning, she notices a thin layer of fine white powder drywall dust coating the edge of her dining room table. At the time, Clara just rationalizes it. She's exhausted. Working 12-hour shifts on your feet scrambles your brain. Think about how many times you've misplaced your phone or your keys while you were tired. You don't assume a stalker broke in to move them. You assume you're just losing your mind a little bit. But then comes Monday. Clara gets home around 6 p.m. The house is warm this time. But as she walks down the hallway, taking off her jacket, she feels a strange crunch under her sneakers. She looks down. There is a trail of wood shavings and tiny chips of plaster scattered across the hardwood, leading right up to the wall. She follows the trail with her eyes. The decorative wooden baseboard near the floor has been physically pried away from the drywall. The rusty nails are exposed, sticking out like jagged teeth. Clara freezes. She drops her purse. The rationalizations are crumbling. Her phone vibrates in her pocket, shattering the dead silence of the hallway. She jumps, fumbling to pull it out. It's Sal, her landlord. She answers, her voice trembling slightly. "Sal, what the hell did your guys do to my baseboards?" There's a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Clara?" Sal says, sounding completely confused. "What are you talking about?" "The HVAC guys?" Clara says, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "The guys you sent last week. Did they come back?" "Clara." Sal's voice drops, losing all of its usual gruff Staten Island bluster. "I didn't send anyone last week. The HVAC guys canceled on me. They're actually scheduled to come to your place tomorrow morning." The silence that follows in Clara's hallway is suffocating. She looks down at the pried open baseboard. She looks slowly back toward the floor vent in the kitchen. If Sal didn't send anyone, who unscrewed the grate? And who is dismantling her home from the inside out? Clara slowly lowers the phone. The line goes dead, and suddenly, the ambient hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounds deafening. We know from phone records that Clara didn't call 911 immediately, and honestly, if you put yourself in her shoes for a second, that makes sense. Human beings don't instantly jump to, "There is a monster in my house." They hesitate. They doubt themselves. You freeze trying to logic your way out of a nightmare. She spends 3 full minutes just standing in her hallway, clutching her phone. She stares at the pried open baseboards. She thinks about the drywall dust on her dining table. She thinks about the floor vent. And then she hears it. It isn't a footstep from upstairs. It's a soft, rhythmic shifting. The sound of weight being distributed. And it's coming from times inside, times the wall separating the kitchen from the hallway, right next to her shoulder. Clara finally dials 911 at 6:14 p.m. We know from the dispatch audio that she is whispering. She tells the operator that someone is breaking into her home, but she sounds horribly confused, telling the dispatcher, "I think they're inside the house. No, I think they're inside the walls." At 6:16 p.m., the 911 recording captures a loud, violent crash. The sound of drywall physically buckling and splintering. Then, a brief struggle, the phone dropping to the hardwood, and dead silence. When Staten Island detectives arrive at 6:32 p.m., the front door is wide open. The neighborhood is perfectly quiet, just the distant sound of a leaf blower a few streets over. But inside Clara's house, it looks like a demolition zone. Clara is found in the living room. I won't linger on the violence of the scene because the tragedy of her death is awful enough. But what confused the initial responders, what made seasoned detectives stop and stare, was the state of the house itself. At first, they assumed it was a frantic burglary. But burglars toss drawers and flip mattresses. They don't take a crowbar to the architectural skeleton of a house. The baseboards in the hallway were completely ripped away. The heavy bathroom mirror had been unscrewed and pushed outward. The air vents were completely detached. It wasn't until crime scene investigators climbed into the small, cramped crawl space above the ceiling that the darkest truth of this case finally came to light. Her killer hadn't just broken in that afternoon. He had been living inside the walls of her home for at least 3 weeks. Now, at this point, you have to understand the layout. Staten Island homes from that era often have deep wall cavities to accommodate old plumbing and heating ducts. The killer, a transient man with multiple stalking priors who had noticed Clara walking home from her shifts, had slipped in through an unsecured basement window weeks earlier. He hadn't been taking her baseboards apart to get into the walls. He was dismantling her house from the inside out so he could navigate the structure without ever stepping foot in her hallways. The emotional aftermath of this discovery shattered the community. Neighbors began obsessively checking their locks, calling contractors to inspect their attics, and unscrewing their own vents. Clara's landlord, Sal, was practically inconsolable, haunted by the realization that Clara's complaints about the maintenance men were actually her reporting her own killer's movements. Investigators documented the killer's nest in the crawlspace. It is a deeply disturbing catalog of mundane horror. They found flattened cardboard boxes used as a mattress. They found empty plastic bottles of iced tea. They found damp, stale food wrappers. But the final detail, the one that still keeps the lead detectives awake at night, was found tucked into the fiberglass insulation right above Clara's bathroom. They found Clara's missing paring knife. He hadn't just stolen it to use as a weapon. He had used it to slowly, methodically shave away the drywall behind her bathroom mirror until only a paper-thin layer of paint remained. He had poked a tiny hole through that paint, no larger than a pinprick, directly at eye level. When Clara was exhausted, standing at her sink after a 12-hour shift, washing her face, thinking she was completely alone, he had been standing in the dark, inches away, just watching her breathe. The unsweating man. The cold open is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. On the sweltering afternoon of July 18th, paramedics in Southern California responded to a chaotic 911 call near mile 18 of an elite marathon qualifier. When they arrived, they found a 8-year-old man collapsed on the melting asphalt. The man was an Olympic hopeful, someone in peak physical condition, but as the medics rushed over and touched his skin, they physically recoiled. He was radiating heat like a cast iron stove. A medic quickly took his core temperature. It was 107.8 degrees Fahrenheit. His organs were actively shutting down. But there was one detail that completely baffled the first responders. It was 98 degrees outside. The man had just run 18 miles at a blistering pace, yet his skin was bone dry. There was not a single drop of sweat on him. He wasn't just having a severe heat stroke, he was somehow hermetically sealed, cooking from the inside out. And the terrifying truth is, the thing that was killing him wasn't the brutal weather. It was his own meticulous preparation. It was a fatal mistake he had made in his own bathroom just 3 hours earlier. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. The call to action is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. But before we get into the deeply disturbing details of this case, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in a grounded documentary style, please kindly invite the like button over to help you paint your living room, but when they arrive, hand them a single toothbrush and tell them to start on the baseboards. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. The normal world. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Elias Vance was what you would call a total pro. At 28, he had spent the last decade of his life optimizing every single variable of his existence for one singular purpose: long-distance running. And honestly, Elias wasn't just disciplined, he was obsessive. If you walked into his sparse one-bedroom apartment, you wouldn't see much in the way of decoration. Instead, you'd see biometric spreadsheets taped to the drywall, expensive heart rate monitors charging on the kitchen counter right next to an open bag of stale coffee grounds, and a perfectly aligned row of running shoes squeaking against the linoleum. He was the kind of guy who would literally weigh his socks to make sure they weren't carrying extra moisture. Now, at this point in his career, Elias was on the absolute cusp of qualifying for the Olympic team. But to secure his spot, he had to dominate a highly publicized qualifying race in the high desert. He knew the heat was going to be the great equalizer. The human body can only take so much ambient temperature before biological functions begin to fail, so Elias spent weeks meticulously researching heat management. And this obsessive trait, which had brought him so much success, is exactly what set the stage for his downfall. At the time, his girlfriend Sarah thought his intense preparation was just business as usual. He was spending late nights on deep web athletic forums, reading up on experimental gear and marginal gains. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just Elias being Elias. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The first disturbance is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. About a week before the race, the mailman dropped off a nondescript, heavy cardboard box on Elias's porch. It was from a boutique sports science laboratory that Elias had privately reached out to. Inside was a large, unmarked jar containing a prototype thermal barrier gel. The marketing packet claimed it was a revolutionary liquid skin, a microscopic polymer that you slather all over your body to completely block UV radiation, insulate against external ambient heat, and eliminate 100% of friction and chafing. Elias opened the jar. It had a strange, sterile smell, almost like industrial caulk, mixed with cheap sunscreen. He scooped a small amount onto his fingertips and rubbed it onto his forearm. Almost immediately, the gel hardened into an invisible, slightly glossy shell. He stood there, in his bathroom, just staring at it. It felt weirdly tight. When he ran his arm under the tap, the water didn't just beat up, it physically repelled off his skin, leaving it perfectly dry. Elias hesitated for a second. The tightness felt unnatural, almost suffocating on his arm. He flexed his wrist, feeling the artificial resistance. But he quickly rationalized it away. He figured the tightness just meant the seal was working. He was a professional. He was entirely used to physical discomfort. He wiped down the counter, left the jar right next to his toothbrush, and went to bed. At the time, this didn't seem strange, which actually mattered later because he had no way of knowing that this simple jar of experimental ointment was effectively a biological straitjacket. The morning of the race arrived. The air in the starting parking lot was already thick, stagnant, and oppressive. You could hear the distant, hollow clunking of porta-potty doors and the nervous, hushed chatter of runners adjusting their bib numbers. In the back of his rented SUV, away from the crowds, Elias stripped down. He opened the jar of the prototype gel, and because he was a man who believed in absolute, total optimization, he didn't just apply a thin layer to his legs. He spent 20 minutes methodically slathering the thick, unyielding polymer over every single inch of his body, his legs, his chest, his back, his neck. He completely sealed himself in. Suspense, escalation, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. The starting gun went off. And honestly, for the first 10 miles, Elias felt invincible. The pacing was perfect, his breathing was steady, and the ambient temperature was already climbing past 100 degrees. Around him, the other runners were visibly suffering. You could hear the heavy, rhythmic slapping of wet running shoes on the baking asphalt, see the dark, soaked patches on their shirts, and smell that sharp scent of hot tarmac and mass exertion. But Elias? Elias was completely dry. At first, he thought the gel was a miracle. The wind whipped past him, and the tight, invisible shell over his skin seemed to be doing exactly what the marketing packet promised, blocking the brutal external heat of the desert sun. He was cruising, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but right around mile 14, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic wall of pain. It was just a slow, creeping heaviness. A strange, deep-seated warmth blooming in the center of his chest. He shook his arms out, trying to loosen up, but that tight, suffocating feeling he had noticed in the bathroom the night before was back. Only now, it was everywhere. His heart rate monitor beeped, a sharp digital warning cutting through the quiet desert air. His pulse was spiking to 185 beats per minute, way too high for this stage of the race. He slowed his pace slightly, taking deep, gasping breaths, but the air felt thin, and the heat radiating from his own torso was becoming unbearable. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, false explanation, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. At this point, you have to understand the mindset of an elite athlete. They are trained to rationalize physical agony. Elias didn't immediately panic or think about the experimental gel. He just figured he was hitting the proverbial wall early. It was 105 degrees outside after all. He assumed it was classic textbook dehydration. His brain told him that he had miscalculated his fluid intake and that the arid desert air was just wicking the sweat off his body faster than he could feel it. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than, BR is greater than. About a mile later, he saw the white canopy of an official medical and hydration tent shimmering in the heat haze. The setup was totally mundane, just folding tables, sticky puddles of spilled electrolyte drinks on the dirt, a few exhausted volunteers holding out paper cups, and a giant cooler of ice water. Elias stumbled toward it. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, a telltale sign of heat exhaustion. A medical volunteer asked if he wanted to sit down, noting how violently flushed his face was. Elias waved her off. He just needed to cool down his core temperature. He grabbed a massive, soaking wet sponge from one of the ice buckets, tilted his head back, and squeezed the freezing water directly over his head, neck, and chest. He waited for that immediate, shocking relief of cold water hitting overheated skin. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, collapse of truth, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but the relief never came. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And here is where the truth actually started to break through. When Elias squeezed the sponge, the water didn't soak into his skin. It didn't spread, and it didn't evaporate. It literally hit the invisible polymer shell, beat it up like rain on a freshly waxed car, and rolled right off into the dirt. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, staring blankly at the wet spots on the dry desert ground. He dropped the sponge and reached a trembling hand up to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but there was no sweat. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. He dragged his fingers hard across his cheek, then his neck, then his chest. His skin was bone dry. In fact, it was glossy, tightly sealed, and incredibly hot to the touch, like touching the metal door of a baking oven. The horrifying realization hit him all at once, shattering the dehydration theory. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. He wasn't dehydrated. His hydration pack was still half full. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. The human body survives extreme heat through a very specific biological function, evaporation. We sweat, the moisture hits the air, and it cools our blood, which in turn cools our internal organs. It's the only way we don't literally boil alive. Elias hadn't stopped sweating because he was out of fluids. He had stopped sweating because the liquid skin he had meticulously painted over every inch of his body was absolutely impermeable. He had physically glued his own pores shut. For the last 2 hours, running under a blistering sun, his body had been desperately trying to vent heat. But it couldn't. He had effectively wrapped himself in microscopic cling wrap. He wasn't just overheating from the desert sun, he was trapped inside a sealed biological pressure cooker, and he was cooking himself from the inside out. The reveal, the twist, and honestly, trying to imagine the sheer claustrophobic terror Elias must have felt in that specific moment is almost impossible. He stood there at the edge of the hydration station, staring down at his arms. He started dragging his fingernails across his forearms, digging in hard, trying to scratch off the invisible layer of polymer. But his nails just slid uselessly over the smooth synthetic barrier. He was panting heavily now, taking short, shallow gasps. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly entirely devoid of strength, and collapsed hard into the dry dirt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. At first, the medical volunteers, mostly off-duty nurses and local college kids, didn't panic. They had seen heat exhaustion 100 times. A couple of them jogged over, grabbed him by the armpits, and dragged him into the shade of the main medical tent. It was a chaotic, thoroughly mundane scene inside. The smell of dusty canvas, spilled iodine, and stale coffee. A radio crackled in the background with boring race updates. The lead medic, an older guy who was casually chewing on a pen cap, ordered the standard protocol. Get him on the cot. Pack his neck, armpits, and groin with ice. Let's get an IV going. Now at this point, they fully expected him to stabilize. But when a young nurse went to insert the IV needle into the crook of Elias's arm, the needle literally slipped sideways. She frowned, apologizing, thinking she had just misjudged the angle. She wiped the area with an alcohol swab, but the alcohol just beat it up and rolled off onto the squeaky vinyl cot. She tried again, and she had to use a disturbing amount of physical force just to puncture the microscopic, hardened shell covering his skin. While she struggled with the IV, the lead medic checked Elias's core temperature using a tympanic ear thermometer. The thermometer beeped. It read 106.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The medic stared at the screen, second-guessing the equipment. He swapped the thermometer for a backup and checked again. 107.4 degrees. At this temperature, the proteins in the human brain literally begin to denature. It is a fatal threshold. The medic dropped the thermometer and placed his bare hand flat against Elias's chest to check for a pulse. He froze. Elias was radiating an unnatural burning heat, but his skin was completely impossibly dry. It felt like touching the hood of a car that had been sitting in a sweltering parking lot all day. "Why isn't he sweating?" the medic muttered, confusion rapidly giving way to outright panic. "He feels like plastic." Emotional aftermath. Before we get to the devastating conclusion of Elias's fatal mistake, if you want to support the channel, please offer to help the like button paint their living room, but secretly mix a heavy dose of industrial superglue into the primer so they can never, ever change the color. Thanks. The medical tent devolved into absolute, terrifying chaos. The casual atmosphere shattered. Medics were screaming for a medevac helicopter. They began frantically pouring entire coolers of ice water over Elias, hoping to force his core temperature down. But because the water couldn't make contact with his actual skin, the heat couldn't transfer efficiently. He was perfectly insulated. The ice just slid off him into the dirt. By the time Elias's support crew arrived at the tent, out of breath and holding the empty canister of the liquid skin spray, Elias was seizing violently. When the crew chief stammered out what Elias had done, how he had painted himself in an aerospace-grade urethane sealant to reduce wind resistance, the medics were paralyzed. There was no medical protocol for this. You can't just peel off a microscopic chemical bond. They actually grabbed rough surgical scrub brushes, desperately trying to scrape the sealant off his chest and stomach so his body could breathe. But the polymer had been engineered specifically to withstand extreme friction. It held fast. The sound of the medevac helicopter drowned out the shouting in the tent as Elias was loaded onto a stretcher. His crew stood helpless in the blowing dust, watching the aircraft lift off, a heavy, sinking realization settling over them. Final aftershock. Despite the doctors at the hospital eventually using heavy chemical solvents to break down the barrier, it was too late. The prolonged exposure to an internal temperature of over 107 degrees had caused catastrophic multi-organ failure. Elias slipped into a coma from which he would never wake up. Later, when investigators reviewed the physical evidence from the race, they found the empty aerosol can of the experimental aerodynamic spray discarded in the team's trash bin. Elias had spent his entire life obsessing over how to push his body to the absolute limit. He wanted to cheat the wind. He wanted to become a perfectly frictionless object. And in the end, he succeeded. But printed right there on the back of the sleek silver canister, in incredibly small, mundane black text, was a warning label that Elias had either ignored or simply arrogantly believed his Olympic endurance could outlast. Warning: for use on carbon fiber equipment only. Highly impermeable. Under absolutely no circumstances should this product be applied to human skin. Blood in the concrete, the hit that wasn't. Cold open hook. It was raining. Not a dramatic thunderstorm, just that miserable, freezing November drizzle that coats everything in a thin layer of ice and makes the streetlights look hazy. The person sitting in the idling lease sedan didn't seem to mind. They had been parked in the shadows of the gravel lot for almost 2 hours, staring at a single lit window in a corrugated steel office building. Around 8:15 p.m., the office light clicked off. A man walked out. You could hear his keys jingling in the quiet night as he pulled his heavy jacket collar up against the wind, head down, making a beeline for his pickup truck. The person in the sedan stepped out. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They walked calmly up behind the man, raised a 9mm pistol, and fired 2 shots directly into the back of his head. The sound was muffled by the rain. The man dropped instantly onto the wet gravel. The shooter stood there for a second, looking down. Then they simply turned, walked back to their car, put it in drive, and rolled away into the dark. And honestly, the whole thing was so clean, so surgical, and so completely devoid of any messy emotion that when detectives finally arrived and taped off the lot, they took one look at the body and immediately came to a very specific conclusion. They thought, this is a professional hit. This is the mafia. But they were wrong. The truth of what happened that night was a lot closer to home, far more amateurish, and incredibly tragic. Normal world setup. To understand how completely the police misread the situation, you have to understand the victim. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, though everybody just called him Artie. Artie didn't run an underground gambling ring. He didn't owe money to the mob. He ran Penhaligon Commercial Paving. He was 56 years old, and his life was, frankly, exhausting. He was the kind of guy who woke up every single morning at 4 a.m. without an alarm clock. His routine was always the same. 2 cups of cheap, stale drip coffee out of a scratch thermos, sitting in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, just trying to gather the energy to face the day. He was a guy with dirt permanently wedged under his fingernails and a bad lower back. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Brenda, for over 30 years. They lived in a normal, slightly cluttered suburban house with a golden retriever and a stack of junk mail on the kitchen counter that they always meant to sort through but never actually did. Artie wasn't a gangster. He was a small business owner stressed out about rising diesel costs, supply chain delays, and making sure his 12 employees got their paychecks on Friday. He was totally ordinary. And at the time, nobody in his life, not his wife, not his kids, not his friends, thought he was in any kind of danger. Why would they? Life was just life. First disturbance. But looking back, there were signs. Tiny, weird anomalies that didn't make sense until long after the yellow police tape was rolled up. Now at this point, you have to put yourself in Artie's shoes to understand why he didn't run. It was late October, about 3 weeks before the murder. Artie was working late in the dispatch trailer. It was a Tuesday evening, and the yard was mostly empty. Around 7 p.m., he heard the heavy crunch of tires on the gravel outside. He looked out the frosted, dirty window of his office, and saw a dark blue sedan sitting at the very edge of the lot near the chain-link gate. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. He could see the thick white exhaust pluming in the cold air. Artie didn't panic. He actually just sat there in his desk chair, holding a stack of invoices, and watched it. People used his lot to turn around all the time. He watched the car for a minute, maybe a minute and a half. The car just sat there, idling in the dark. Someone inside was watching the trailer. Then, very slowly, it backed out onto the street and drove away. Artie actually mentioned it to his foreman, a guy named Dave, the very next morning. It was just a passing comment over coffee. "Hey, some weirdo was parked out by the gate last night." Dave asked if he got a plate number. Artie said no, which actually mattered later, because that plate could have blown the whole case wide open. But at the time, they both just laughed it off. They figured it was teenagers looking for a place to drink, or a lost delivery driver. You see, when you live a normal life, you don't immediately jump to the conclusion that someone is hunting you. You rationalize it. You downplay it. You just go back to worrying about the concrete pour scheduled for noon. But then, the silent phone calls started at the house. Just dead air when Brenda picked up the receiver. And slowly, a quiet, creeping feeling that something was very wrong began to bleed into Artie's ordinary world. And honestly, you can only ignore those silent phone calls for so long before it starts to wear on you. By early November, the air was getting colder, and that creeping dread was becoming a permanent fixture in Artie's life. He started doing little things, subtle things that showed he was spooked, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. He'd wait in his truck with the doors locked until his employees showed up in the morning. He started double-checking the deadbolt at home, lingering by the front window, just staring out at the quiet suburban street, listening to the wind rattle the bare oak branches. Brenda noticed, of course. You don't sleep next to someone for 20 years and not feel when their heart is racing. But when she asked him what was wrong, Artie just blamed it on the stress of a new municipal parking garage contract. He downplayed it. It was that imperfect, human denial. He didn't want to scare her. And then came Thursday, November 14th, the day the normal world completely shattered. Artie usually walked through the front door at 6:15 p.m., right when the local news was starting. By 7:30, Brenda was pacing the kitchen. She tried his cell straight to voicemail. She called the office, ringing, dead air. At 8:15 p.m., she called Dave, the foreman. Dave lived about 10 minutes from the yard. He drove over in his sweatpants, annoyed but figuring Artie just fell asleep at his desk or his truck battery died. Dave pulled into the gravel lot. The heavy equipment was silent, casting long, monstrous shadows under the single, flickering sodium street lamp. The door to the dispatch trailer was slightly ajar. Dave walked up the wooden steps, pushing the door open, the hinges whining in the cold air. And what he saw in that cramped, fluorescent-lit office is something he would never be able to unsee. Artie was slumped over his metal desk, surrounded by scattered invoices and a massive, dark pool of blood soaking into the cheap carpet. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. It was brutal, efficient, and cold. When the police arrived, they taped off the lot, set up the blinding halogen work lights, and the rumor mill immediately started churning. Now at this point, you have to look at the environment. It's the Northeast. It's the concrete business. It's municipal contracts. The detectives walked into that trailer, saw an unrobbed cash box, untouched expensive equipment, and an execution-style double tap to the back of the head. It looked like a professional hit. A textbook mafia assassination. And honestly, it made total sense. The police dove headfirst into this theory. They spent weeks drinking stale coffee in idling unmarked cars outside known mob hangouts. They pulled all of Artie's business records, looking for the smoking gun. Did he owe a loan shark? Was he being extorted by union bosses? They found out Artie had recently underbid a rival concrete company for that big city parking garage project, a company whose owner had known ties to organized crime families in the area. It was the perfect narrative. It gave the chaos a shape, a logical, cinematic reason for existing. The local papers ran with it. The family was horrified, wondering if the man they loved had a secret dark life. But the truth is, real life is rarely like the movies. And this perfectly logical explanation was about to completely collapse under the weight of sloppy, messy reality. The first crack in the mafia theory came from the financial forensic accountants. They went through every ledger, every W-2, every bank deposit, and found absolutely nothing. Artie was boringly clean. He paid his taxes, he didn't gamble, he had no hidden debts. Then, the physical evidence started contradicting the narrative. The ballistics report finally came back from the state lab. The murder weapon wasn't a professional hitman's suppressed 9mm or a clean .22 caliber pistol. The killer used a 1.6 gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot. It was a chaotic, sloppy weapon that caused a wide spray effect with little pellets. No professional assassin uses birdshot to make a clean hit. It's far too unpredictable. And then there was the footprint. Near the base of the desk, perfectly preserved in a puddle of spilled dried coffee, was a single partial shoe print. The detectives measured it. It was a size 8. Small. Narrow. Far too small to belong to the hulking mob enforcers they had been tailing for 3 weeks. As Detective Miller sat in his cluttered cubicle staring at that photo of the size 8 footprint, the sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't a professional hit ordered by a mafia boss. The whole organized crime angle was a massive, time-wasting red herring. They were looking for a ghost in a tailored suit, but the real killer was someone entirely different. Someone messy. Someone much, much closer to home. And honestly, when you have to pivot a murder investigation from an organized mob hit to someone inside the victim's inner circle, it is an ugly, deeply uncomfortable transition. The detectives didn't want to believe it. It's much easier to blame a faceless syndicate than to look at a grieving family and wonder which one of them pulled the trigger. At first, they quietly worked their way through the outer rings of Artie's life. They spent a week looking into a cousin who had a minor drug charge in the 90s. A dead end. Then they looked at a neighbor who had complained about the noise from Artie's work trucks. Another dead end. The whole time they were stuck on that 1.6 gauge shotgun and that size 8 shoe. Now, at this point, Detective Miller was exhausted. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and he drove out to Artie's house to update the widow, Elaine, on the case. He walked into the kitchen, and the house smelled like pine sol and stale coffee, that distinct, heavy scent of a home where someone has recently died and people are just desperately trying to keep busy. Elaine was sitting at the kitchen island, looking hollowed out, wearing a faded, oversized sweater. Sitting across from her was Artie's two-year-old son, Justin. Justin was a quiet kid, always a little small for his age, struggling to find his footing in the world. He was the one who had initially found the body, the one who had made that hysterical 911 call. Miller sat down at the table, wrapped his hands around a cheap ceramic mug of coffee Elaine had poured him, and just let the silence hang for a moment. He looked across the table at Justin. Justin was staring at the floor, bouncing his leg nervously. And that's when Miller's eyes fell on Justin's feet. He was wearing a pair of worn-out work boots. Small. Narrow. Size 8. Miller's stomach gave a slow, sickening lurch. But lots of guys wear size 8, right? He tried to brush it off, second-guessing himself. He looked away from Justin's feet and scanned the kitchen island. Right in the middle of the counter was a massive, chaotic stack of condolence cards. Hundreds of them. Neighbors, friends, rival concrete companies, all sending their sympathies. Elaine had been meticulously opening them and storing them in a sturdy green and yellow cardboard box to keep them organized. Now, if you've ever been in a grieving house, you know people use whatever they can find to store things. Tupperware, shoe boxes, whatever is handy. Early on in the investigation, Miller had seen that box and thought absolutely nothing of it. It was just a family trying to manage their grief. But today, with the ballistics report burned into his brain, Though actually looked at the faded, peeling label on the side of that green and yellow box. his breath hitched in his chest. It was a vintage Remington box. 1.6 gauge. Birdshot. The exact, highly specific ammunition used to execute Artie. The breathing room in that kitchen suddenly vanished. The air felt suffocatingly thick. Miller looked from the box of shotgun shells to Justin's size 8 boots, and the entire, terrifying truth collapsed into place. This wasn't a professional hitman. It was a terrified, desperate kid. Police later reconstructed exactly what happened, and it was devastatingly sloppy. Justin had quietly racked up a massive underground sports gambling debt. Not to the mafia, just to local bookies. He was drowning. Artie had found out and threatened to cut him off entirely to let him face the consequences. And so, Justin panicked. On the night of the murder, Justin didn't walk into the office with the cold precision of a mob enforcer. He walked in trembling. He took his grandfather's old bird-hunting shotgun from the back of the garage. The air must have burned his lungs as he stood behind his father. He hesitated. His hands shook so badly, he almost dropped the weapon. When he finally pulled the trigger, the 1.6, Gage kicked back fiercely, bruising his shoulder. It wasn't a clean, surgical strike. It was a chaotic, messy blast of birdshot. Then, in a blind panic, Justin tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but realized he hadn't taken the cash box. He tried to make it look like a hit, stepping in the spilled coffee by the desk, leaving that single damning footprint. The emotional aftermath of this realization fractured the family beyond repair. When Miller gently asked Elaine to step out of the kitchen, she already knew. You could see the horror wash over her face as she looked at her son. She didn't scream. She just let out this low, guttural sob and collapsed into a kitchen chair, watching the detectives handcuff the boy she had raised for murdering the man she had loved. It was an unbearable, quiet tragedy. There were no cinematic monologues, just a kid crying silently as he was led out the front door. But the final, most haunting detail, the thing that stayed with Detective Miller for the rest of his career, happened an hour later when evidence technicians were bagging up that Remington box. They had to empty out all the heartfelt condolence cards first. They removed letters from sobbing relatives, notes of sympathy from old friends, prayers for peace. And there, at the very bottom of the box, buried beneath a literal mountain of the town's grief and sympathy, was the original, crumpled paper receipt for the birdshot. Justin hadn't even thrown it away. He had just buried his guilt under the sympathy of strangers, hoping no one would ever look close enough to see the monster hiding in plain sight.